Just wanted to say welcome to this session is on participatory grant making, deciding together shifting power and resources through participatory grant making. Today we'll be talking about what participatory grant making is and how it is creating systemic change across the field. I'm really excited for this conversation and to learn with you all. Participatory grant making and power shifting is one of my favorite subjects in the field, and I'm excited to explore how a wider range of folks can learn about it and explore practicing it. Really quickly to introduce myself, my name is Sarina Dayal. I take they or she pronouns, and I'm a research specialist at Candid. Almost exactly 3 years ago, which was one of the first projects I worked on at Candid, Candid published a guide on participatory grant making to help funders understand what the practice is, how it can be done, and why. And since then, it's been just really amazing to witness the growing movement around this work and the ethos of power shifting. I'll talk a little bit more about the framing in a minute, but first I just want to finish framing today's conversation and introduce Megan, who will be joining me. Megan, as Laura just said, is the CEO of Catalyst San Diego, and she'll be chatting with us through the work that Catalyst does, how they do participatory grant making. And I have a few questions I'll be asking Megan to reflect on. And then at the end, we'll save some time for questions you all have. Also, though, if you have questions throughout the session, feel free to chat them in. You can put them in the Pathable, though. I think the chat for the Zoom is disabled. So please go to the Pathable and we'll keep an eye on those. And if anything comes up during our conversation, we'll also just check in on those and try to bring them in throughout. And this session will wrap at 3. Before we get into the convo, I just want to do some level setting for those that are learning about participatory grant making for the first time. I wanted to share the definition, so what we're talking about. I'm just going to read the definition now. So this is just like helpful to level set. The definition of participatory grant making is participatory grant making cedes decision-making power about funding, including the strategy and criteria behind those decisions, to the very communities that funders aim to serve. So this is what constitutes participatory grant making. The idea of ceding power, I think it moves us towards making grant making and funding more effective, more transparent, and responsive to the needs and demands of community. This practice also puts people at the center of identifying both the problems and the solutions needed for their communities to thrive. So that's really like what this is. I also just want to offer that participatory grant making comes in all different shapes and sizes and models, which is what we learned in our research in putting together the guide. And we'll also hear, a little bit about what Megan has seen in today's conversation. Like everything else in our sector, there's truly isn't a one size fits all approach to this work. And then on top of that, I wanted to share that participatory grant making is just one practice that is part of a broader movement to shift power in the social sector. So I know we have a mixed audience today, and at Network Days, not everyone is necessarily a grant maker, but many of us are likely interested in this conversation because we seek to advance inclusive and democratic participation and decision-making in systems and structures that exist across society, regardless of what our work looks like. And in this little diagram here, you can see of participatory grant making, like what it is. There are 2 circles, process and ethos. And so especially in understanding the ethos of this work, I hope is something anyone can take away from the conversation. I think there are ways both funders and nonprofits alike can practice the democratic values that we'll touch on throughout today in their own internal systems and structures and decision-making protocols. Real quick, just wanted to throw out a few homes for resources in this work. First is Candid's home for this work, which is on grantcraft.org/participatory grantmaking. It's also linked in the Pathable resources. In addition to the guide, we produced a number of blogs, videos, and other short form resources to help anyone interested in learning more about this work engage. And what I especially love about this body of work is it's grounded in human rights and the wisdom of grassroots grant makers. And it really shows how learning can happen across size, geography, issue focus, and type of work. And then secondly, I just want to share about the community of practice that has been born actually in the last year. So just in March 2020 of last year, we seen nothing but growth around this practice, even though it's been around for decades. And it's just really exciting that more and more funders around the globe are not only becoming interested in it and like the value set, but more so are thinking about how to pragmatically shift to doing this practice. So there exists this participatory grant-making community to share resources, challenges, cheerlead the practice, and it's a wonderful, welcoming community for anyone interested as well. So link to this and the guide and a few other resources in Pathable, you can refer to them later through the Pathable. That's all for framing. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can just dig into the conversation. To get us started, I'm going to hand it over to Megan to describe what she does. Megan, if you want to just kick us off with a little bit about yourself, Catalyst, and how you started off doing participatory grant making work.
Yes, thank you, Sarina. Thank you, Candid, and thank you to all of the folks who are here. We're pushing up to about 100 folks, and I'm so happy to be with you. And I was thinking this morning about the conversation that we're going to be having and like, why is this so important? And I can tell you that welcome to my home. Yep, we're in the back bedroom. Down the hill, there's an elementary school, and I have so missed what I can hear right now, which is just the chaotic, unbridled joy of children running around at recess, screaming and laughing and doing the things that children do. And it takes me to this place of relationship and you know, for children, it's a lot easier to see another little human and be curious, right? Want to know what they're all about and why they're different and what is the same, and you know, get in the sandbox, virtual and real. And so as I hear this sort of chatter behind me, it really reminds me of the purpose of participatory grant making, which is to dismantle the power dynamics in grant making. But how we do that is really by acknowledging, accepting, and addressing who we are in a larger system, and then building relationships and understanding that every person has something to contribute. And it's because we are different that this is such a powerful approach to the distribution of funds. That's not a barrier, that is a benefit. So my name is Megan Thomas. I'm the president and CEO at Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and all the little children back there and myself, we're all here present on the traditional and unceded land of the Kumeyaay people. So that's sort of like San Diego, Imperial County, Southern California. Our organization has been around for going on 45 years now. Many of you may be familiar with it as San Diego Grantmakers. We are a regional association of grantmakers, about a community of funders of all types, investors, public funders, foundations of the sort of traditional sort that you know, and we come together for learning and for action. And about 6 years ago, we were really blessed with the gift of a trust-based grant maker who came to us. They were expanding their grant making. And there's actually a report that I'll put in that files section that I haven't yet that talks about that. But they brought us everybody's holy grail, multi-year general operating support, and said, you know, move our mission forward in your region. And so one of the things that we did was create the Social Equity Collaborative Fund, which is mostly what I'll talk about today. And the idea was to look at participatory grant making. And I want to put an asterisk on that to come back to, like, I think Sarina gave a really great definition. And that's sort of a field in which to plant your own participatory grant making flowers rather than sort of like the concrete or frame. So we wanted to do that and pointed it towards what ends up being racial justice, grassroots, collaborative efforts. There were twofold reasons to do this, because our community, our role in the community of funders is to create a space for learning and connection. And so not only did we want to move money, which we did, about $2.5 million so far in the last 5 years, to these grassroots groups, We want to move money into the sort of hard to find and hard to fund groups. And we wanted to do it in a different way, in this participatory grant making way. But we also wanted to create a place where we would learn and that would offer a platform for learning for funders. And that's really worked. We've learned a lot. The steering committees have learned a lot. We've begun to be able to incorporate other folks who are interested into that sort of learning space where they can show up in some of the committee meetings, they can connect with the grantees. And we're really having opportunities like this to talk about it. So I'll leave it there for now, but really looking forward to talking more in detail.
Thanks, Megan. That was a really great interaction. And it was also just really nice to learn a little bit more about yourself and where you're set. And I'm thinking about the piece you said about like centering relationships. And I'm just wondering in the work that you've done, like how has Catalyst moved to like bring people into this process? And I think something that we hear a lot about this is the question of like, is this practice more or less effective than normal forms of grant making? And so in the process of bringing people in, building relationship, is there anything that you've had to like, step into sharing about like the effectiveness of like why you believe it's effective and in considering like how people get brought into the work?
Yeah. Is it effective? I mean, I guess all of it, like metrics are fungible, right? Like data, what do they say? Garbage in, garbage out. It's all how you create an evaluation determines sort of what results you get. We've all experienced, I have a beloved partner, and because I've interacted with them and donated them, I get these surveys, and my husband, bless him, keeps me on my toes. He reads it and he goes like, this is for you, right? It's very leading. So is it effective? Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I think if we talk about participatory grant making as a bridge, a pathway to an ultimate goal of returning, because what we've done as a sector, and I think we all have to come into this with a sense of humility and a sense of learning and not do our best to be as least defensive as possible. But the sector of philanthropy has really taken resources, put them in a place where we can command and control them, and then used that to have a degree of influence that maybe we don't actually deserve, because maybe we don't actually know as much as people on the ground over what's happening. So participatory grant making, meaning getting people who are closer to the action, closer to the pain, closer to the impact, involved in and eventually really controlling how resources are distributed. I think if our ultimate goal is to cede power to the people for whom the resources really are A, meant, and B, extracted from, then yeah, it's really effective. But going back to that asterisk, so the Social Equity Collaborative Fund, which is what we have, is a steering committee of about 8 people who are to various degrees part of the community. There's a couple of funders there who are really instrumental in securing the funds and have practiced a degree of action and relationship building and power building within communities. But the majority of the group is made up of people who are founders of grassroots nonprofit organizations. They might be researchers who are directly kind of embedded in and working with communities and have been doing this for a decade. But I put us kind of on the like middle of the spectrum of participatory grant making. You can go all the way to the end of residents, like actually just people out in the community who are given the place to come together and make these decisions, on back to sort of traditional grant making. So I think we're still, we're not resident driven. We're not even 100% sort of nonprofit decision maker driven, but we're very cognizant of that and really understand that in the work, I mean, San Diego and Imperial counties are extremely diverse. There's 100 languages spoken here. We have people coming from many, many countries of many different statuses. And so there's no way we're going to have full representation, like on an individual basis in the decision making. So we really worked hard to think about our ethos, like what are the values we're trying to move forward? What is the approach we're going to take? How are we going to interrogate ourselves to make sure that we are doing this work from a standpoint of making sure that community voice is heard and that we are transparent, open, that anybody can come to us at any time and give us advice, make a complaint, which has happened and it's uncomfortable, but it's so awesome. And so, yeah. I'll just, I could. So
I'm excited because of that. And yeah, no, that makes so much sense. I think that this last piece about like who it's the effectiveness is not about like getting it right 100% of the time. And I think that that is an ethos that is grounded in so much of the work that I've heard from different participatory grant makers. Like everyone knows that it's like, we're iterating. We might not get it right all the time. We might not include everybody who we might need to from the get-go or even like 10 rounds in. You know, it's going to be a process that we're open to constantly being iterative in. And also I love that you just like named the reality of like, yeah, philanthropy, what is it? Where was it born from? This extraction of wealth and creating all of the systems that like philanthropy uses to like run its processes are just things that like philanthropy has then made up. So we can make up new systems like this and choose to define our effectiveness by having it like value centered. So yeah, and I think that's the way that a lot of the people doing this work like move through this. So yeah, that was great. I'd love to learn a little bit more about like the model that Catalyst has done, and if you want to share any challenges that have come through the process that like Catalyst has gone through already with participatory grant making.
Yeah. I mean, so from my perspective, our vision is a collaborative, impactful, equitable social change ecosystem. So we're always thinking about what's the impact at the community level. But our mission, right, like the lever that we pull, the people we're most often talking to are the funders. So I think what you said about sort of we can recreate for ourselves is actually the only way we can do it, right? Because the system is currently set up that we have control, right? Like the funders have control. So we're the ones that have to make the decision to start to experiment with different ways of grant making and bringing in different people into seats of power. And so the number one thing that we really had to grapple with for that was talking about conflict of interest. We are so imbued in this idea that to extract conflict of interest so nobody can be accused of sort of favoritism or like predetermining an outcome. And yet we also don't want to preclude benefit to a community member who's going to contribute their wisdom and their time to this process. And so we knew from the start that we didn't want to create a process that would say, we want you to help come in, be a steering committee member, contribute to these conversations, be a part of helping us create a new way of doing things. And that then means that your community can't benefit from the process, right? And that really blended well with this idea that one of the, I think, key characteristics of the way that we've approached participatory grant making, one, knowing that we're not going to have everybody around the table. So somebody is inevitably going to feel, and probably rightfully so, that their unique, specific perspective wasn't taken into account. And two, just the reality of grant making is there's not enough money to go around. There's going to be much more amazing work happening than we have the funds to provide. So we really looked at having a high degree of accessibility and transparency. And so one of the documents that's actually in the files section that I knew ahead of time I was going to talk about is our conflict of interest cert policy and form. And I really like a phrase that was used by one of the steering committee members to try and characterize what we were trying to get to, which was to shift from a framing of conflict of interest towards thinking about confluence of interest. We know that we want the benefit of people's experience and wisdom from in the community. Like we're specifically these folks out. And so what we actually want to eliminate is that they are unduly influencing on behalf of any specific organization or effort. And so I won't walk through the whole thing because you can go and look at it. But basically it says, come into the space, tell us everything you know. If it gets to the point that we want to know about a specific organization that you're financially tied to, like, you know, don't advocate, but do answer. We'll ask you questions. We'll invite you into that conversation. And it's worked really well. And I haven't, I mean, you know, people, again, with the power dynamic, don't tend to tell funders when they're upset with them, but we haven't heard anything bad about that. But we have had inquiries as to how we avoid conflict, and we were able to be very open about it and acknowledge that, yeah, there's definitely people there who know and care about certain organizations, but they also know you better than a funder otherwise would.
That's really great, because I think that's part of this is also honoring people with lived experience. And part of their lived experience is being a part of these groups and organizations and having, you know, this knowledge set, and that they're allowed to like fully bring that to the table and fully express that in these conversations. And then it sounds like you move through that together and understanding like where might it shift to a point of a conflict, and where is it really valuable to know the different points of connections and background and information people have. Yeah. And my other question around that is just like, are there any barriers that have come up for participation through that work, or are there any barriers for the communities that you've been working with?
Yeah, I'll take like, you know, microphone holders prerogative and just sort of interpret that question. Just say, one of the things we've been talking about, so I said there's about 8 people on the steering committee, and most of them have been there since nearly the inception, so 5 or so years. And so there's sort of 2 parallel things going on. There was always a question of, and this gets a little bit to trust-based philanthropy principles, in addition to certainly providing multi-year general operating support, providing it in amounts that are meaningful. You know, a couple of groups, it was their first ever grant. For one, it, you know, basically doubled their budget. It was a whole thing. But like, what else can we do? So there's always this question of, how do we be inclusive of the grantees and other unfunded partners in the process? How are we building more into the movement than any particular organization? How do we stick with them rather than getting on this train of, you get a grant and then good luck, we need to fund someone else just because. So we've actually been funding 5 of these organizations for the past, I think we've funded 4 or 5 years, right? So like, we really stuck, but that means we didn't have resources to then go out and fund others. And so we wanted to have longevity for them to be able to build. So the 2 things that I think about in terms of barriers to participation, or just like questions around what does participation look like, is there a point at which these grassroots organizations actually grow to a point where if our objective is to fund, again, hard to find, like small, maybe they're not incorporated, like those kinds of groups, do we then like graduate people out maybe into a different role? And for the steering committee itself, there's so much, like, I mean, we spent 18 months building relationship, working through definitions and understanding, and like, there's an incredible amount of what we would call institutional knowledge, relationship, social capital. So we don't want to lose that. And we also want to be able to incorporate sort of, you know, the voices from the community. And this is really where we are now, is, so what does the evolution of that steering committee look like? You know, or do we turn people off? Do we grow it beyond 8 to become, you know, like 20? And as funders start to get excited about that, they actually want into that room. I tell you, I don't blame them. It's like a master's class. I learn something deep and meaningful every day. So how do we evolve the steering committee? And how do we connect with grantees and people we can't fund in meaningful ways that aren't actually the money, knowing that the money is important, but I'm always conflicted. The money isn't the only thing or the most important thing necessarily, but in the society that we have now, you know, it's like capitalist society where we need to print flyers and we need to, like, you need money. So those are kind of the couple things we grapple with.
Yeah, those are really interesting things to be grappling with. And I just want to invite anyone who's listening, if you have any reflections on these questions, because feel like I was like, I don't know what the solution is. What do you do with funds that you've been funding for a long time? And if you're trying to transition and you want to bring other people in, what do you do about like long-term strategies or one-off strategies? Feel free to, I think, chat in the Pathable or raise your hand in Zoom and get off the mute. So I want to make this feel interactive if you do have anything to, any questions or any reflections on what we're talking about. Yeah, and also if not, that's fine. But Megan, I would just love to continue here. Oh, then we have a hand raised.
Oh, so exciting.
Hillary, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks so much, Megan. That's really interesting to hear what you're doing. I will say that at our community foundation, I'm part of the Orcas Island Community Foundation. We've had a community grants program now for 10 years. And the way we've dealt with our committee is that it's a 3-year term, and 1/3 of the committee terms out each time. And we invite members of the community. We try to have a pretty diverse group. And it's been an excellent way for us to get the community, grow the community awareness of grant making and of the needs of the community. We've also flipped it. We go out to the community then and ask for funding. And so we've been able to raise the amount that we give away considerably. We take donations of $10 and up, and we have about 25% of our community participates in funding the grants. And so we're able to do a pretty remarkable grant process with as many community members as possible. And it's been really successful and certainly gave us the muscle memory that when we entered into COVID, people understood how to give, they understood how to ask, and it was remarkable. So I really applaud your efforts.
That's awesome. How big is your committee?
We have a committee of 12, and they each, we have a pretty standard grant process where people, all the nonprofits apply, and then the committee each committee member takes 2 to review, and they actually do the site visits, and then come back and report to the group. And it's we have a few of our board members go through it. We try to get all the board members to go through it at some point, but it's definitely not a board-driven exercise. It's a real community-driven exercise.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things we're sort of working on now, evolving from this, you said that sort of like muscle memory, and we were able to, on a sort of quick turnaround schedule, a couple, 2-3 months rather than a couple of years, distribute census funds in the community through participatory practices. Having that one was actually all nonprofit organizations in the room. And the one challenge there that reminds me of a conversation that Sarina and I had is the difference between doing it on a one-off basis and doing it with sort of repeated instances. There's just like the human, it's game theory, right? Like the human nature is, if you know you're going to have to come back into the room with these same players, you think more long-term and relationship building, versus if it's just one time, then your incentive is to, well, I shouldn't generalize, but in a lot of instances, you're incentivized to get all you can rather than to think about the broader community. And that's been a really important thing.
Well, and that also speaks a little bit to, we're in a very small community and we have 110 nonprofits, but we primarily fund about 20 of them. And they come back year after year.
There's 110 nonprofits in the whole community, as you define it?
Yeah, there are 110 nonprofits.
There's 11,000.
Right, but we're a community of 5,000 people. So it's very, awesome. And it's all, we're on Orcas Island. So up in the San Juans.
Yep.
So, but it's fascinating because when our foundation started, the rule was you could apply 3 times and then you're done. And I was like, well, we're going to run out of people to give money to very quickly if we can stick to that model. And we used to make people come up with a new project every time to apply instead of funding operations. And so now it's just capacity and operate. They don't have to come up with a new hula hoop each time to apply.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, that too goes to this idea of trust-based philanthropy, right? Like how do you use your relationships? How do you take the burden off of folks? I mean, if you know them, right? They don't need to come back again and again. Oh, and sorry, I just stepped on my dog, and prove themselves. That's really great.
Yeah, thanks for the time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that also was making me think about how a lot of like the value add is in the process itself. You're putting people in a room together who are doing similar work, often in a similar place or around a similar issue, who might not otherwise get these opportunities to like be in conversation. And also like support each other's work, which I think is just like really powerful for like movement building. Yeah.
It's been interesting to sort of think about how do we expand the practice, right? Because I said earlier, the part of the point was to get the money out in a way that's not currently being distributed. And we're always very cognizant of not wanting to cannibalize funds that would otherwise go directly to the movement builders, and really be looking for how do we bring money in that wouldn't otherwise be in this community? Or how do we support folks to grant make differently with a racial justice lens, with a community-driven perspective. So that's been important. And now we actually have people interested, and I'm sort of stumped. And hey, Hillary, come on back, or anybody else, around how do we support funders who want to do this work without then diluting the idea of participatory grant making, right? Like we did a round with one of our local community foundations, expanded from racial justice to climate justice. They had some funds they wanted to distribute. They do our grant making committee, and one of their board members, who ultimately was invited to stay permanently because she contributed so much, but joined the committee. But you can't have another funder join the committee every time they have some dollars to contribute, because then otherwise you've got a bunch of funders making decisions, right? But what are the ways to help them build these relationships, get in the mix and understand that's more experiential than this is a wonderful webinar, but it's gonna give you information, but not an experience, right? And so that's a place that I am now, is how do we create more spaces for people to be able to do this? And part of it has been kind of one-on-one relationship building with them, like, hey, come with me, meet these grantees, like not in a webinar, but like, it would be in person if we were in an in-person time, but hey, we're going to do some check-ins with all, just come along, meet them, build a relationship. And then if you want to keep talking to them, great. If they want to reach out to you, great. But yeah, like how you create more places for funders to have this experience when they're not themselves already doing the work.
Yeah, and that's a question I think within the participatory grant making community is also just so relevant. It's like okay, now not everybody, but like we're all here essentially, like everyone who's sitting in this room is doing participatory grant making. Who's not doing it? Who's not here? Who might want to be here? And how do you bring them in? Because I think also sometimes the work, it can get pigeonholed, and I think unjustly, as like being something for more like, funders who might be more open to like non-traditional forms of grant making. But I think there are so many, and this is why like trust-based philanthropy is just like a broader, there's just so much more breadth to the types of ways that people can adopt like the more democratic practices, and trying to like bring those in to just like re-envision like what the philanthropy relationship looks like. And I think just being in a relationship with each other, both being in a relationship, like you said, like having grantees and funders in conversation and creating space for that relationship to flourish, but also having funders just be in relationship to other funders so that they can share in their work and practice and sort of advocate for different ways to like have these models of work. Yeah. On that note, sort of, are there things that you see participation and power shifting like as like remaking philanthropy? Are there things that you're really excited about or dreaming of in the future of this space? And also that's a question I'd love to ask like just the audience in general. Are there things that you'd love to see? Feel free to like chat them in the Pathable. And I think one of the most exciting things to me about conversations around participatory grant making are that it feels like one of many things that really push the conversation of change in how we work, and to slowly like undo the way that philanthropy is like traditionally set up. And so I just want to make room in this conversation too for like, are there things that people are dreaming about to do differently? And what are they? Or are things that people are already doing?
Yeah. I mean, just the fact that there are 100 people showed up to talk about this, I think is super exciting. My hopes and dreams, oh my gosh. One of the things that is important is language, right? How do we talk about people? How do we talk about processes? How do we always catch ourselves? Even as I was just chatting into the path of all your Barbie dream house of philanthropy, I'm like, all right, well, I just went straight to a consumer trope, but that's okay. Everybody knows what I mean, hopefully. But language matters. And for the past several years, we've, as an organization, been on this journey to talk about like, what does our personal, organizational, like community and systemic equity look like? And what's our role in that? Because we can't do it all, but we can do some things, more easily than others. And I think speaking truth and building bridges is one of those things. And so we've started using the language of social change capital rather than grants or investments or public dollars, because ultimately the money is a means to an end, and we actually need it all. There's a really great graphic, and I'll just charades it for you, right? Like, we think when we're in philanthropy, we think about all of the amazing things that can be done and the important things. But if philanthropy, is like a P, public funds are like the Charlie Brown pumpkin, right? Like there's so much more of it. So social change capital is about how does the money that you have control over make a difference in the bigger picture. And that really points us to participatory grant making, or specifically letting communities say what they need. Maybe they're all plugged into some sort of public funding, or maybe they are working on an affordable housing development, or specifically in San Diego recently, in the last few years, we've had a lot of work around supporting people arriving from other countries, right? Immigrants, asylum seekers, and that sort of thing. And there has been lots of state funding and some federal funding, but there are restrictions, right? Very important things that may or may not seem important, but the idea that somebody has a bus ticket to get somewhere, like travel is exempted, but their goal is to get somewhere. And so if we can't help them get there, then what are we doing? Or just offering the culturally appropriate food so that there's a sense of home and safety, like all of these sorts of things. So I think when you get to the heart of participatory grant making, it's about acknowledging that just because we currently are holding the power doesn't mean we actually have the knowledge. And so how do we rewrite our systems and processes and policies to honor that knowledge and experience is actually what's most relevant in trying to create a different future?
Yeah. On that note too, of just being, a place-based organization, working with a lot of different like community-led work, and like the community looks so broad. Are there things just like acknowledging the reality of like the last almost 2 years of being in a pandemic and all the mutual aid work that has like risen, and all these like community-led initiatives? Have you seen any change among both the communities you're working with as well as those funders you're working with in how that lends a lens to this kind of work?
Yeah, for sure. Like I don't think that most people, like you would have said mutual aid to them and they would have been like, mutual aid of Omaha, like what? That model of neighbor helping neighbor has really been super powerful, I think, in modeling that communities know what they need, and that it might look different than what a funder thinks. Maybe they need diapers, maybe they need like a babysitter so they can just have a moment of rest because, oh my gosh. And there has been an interest in figuring out how to fund these folks, and in particular, actually creating pathways, whether it's through fiscal sponsorship or through different, something that's not a grant making process, or by routing funds funds through an intermediary to make sure that the folks who are actually delivering on the day-to-day needs and doing it in unique and creative ways have the resources they need, because those are like, they are getting to the most marginalized folks, right? Black trans women who are undocumented, you know, they're not going to show up to a community center and ask for federal aid, and yet we need to be providing for their needs as well. And that means understanding what it looks like, and that's a model that we can take lessons and learn from them and move them forward little by little. And I think things like the Social Equity Collaborative Fund, the reason why I'm so excited about it is it creates a testing ground, right? Like, it sort of de-risks trying this out. You know, you can come, you can do this with your dollars in a different way than the rest of your portfolio. And we'll share with you the lessons, and you'll get a sense of how it feels. And then maybe you start to do a little bit more, a little bit differently. And it doesn't have to be all at once either. You can incorporate elements of this practice to see how they feel.
Yeah, those are all really great reminders. Taking us into our last couple minutes, just want to make space if anybody did have other questions to raise your hand on the Zoom or type them into the Pathable. Megan, I'll ask you if there's something that you want to just like end and remind folks of. I think the one thing that I'm thinking of just to remind people of is I just get so much out of having these kinds of conversations, and they do feel, I think conversations are important. Sometimes in my just like who I am way, I feel like sometimes conversations, I'm like, and they need to be met with action, but there's so much action happening around this work, which is exciting, that we're hearing about from Megan, that I'm seeing in the community that exists who are doing this work and pushing philanthropy to do better. And so I just want to like leave people with the reminder that there are so many resources out there. There are people to talk to. If this conversation like ignited anything in your thinking about the work you're trying to do, like feel free to reach out or tap into any of those communities that exist to keep like brainstorming how we can do things differently. Yeah, and Megan, any last words from you?
No, I just, I hope you all have my contact info. I'd welcome further conversations. And I know that Candid supports a global, in fact, community of participatory grant makers. I've become an aficionado of Slack because it lets you kind of step in and step out of conversations. So I would say let's just all stay in touch as we burn the dream house down and rebuild a new commune of wellness.
Thank you so much, the two of you, Sarina and Megan. That was wonderful. So appreciate you being here, as well as all of our wonderful participants.